Hey all, Alex here at your home of the Music Deep Dive, and today it is time for a review of the 1989 biography by Hans L. Trefousse, Andrew Johnson, a biography. Hans Trefousse, a German-born author who emigrated to the United States when he was a teenager. This is during the mid-1930s, during the rise of the Nazis. Ends up fighting in World War II for the American side, and his personal background and his experience with discrimination in Nazi Germany seems to have been sort of the bedrock for his interests as a scholar and student of history in the post-World War II era, focusing heavily on sort of discrimination in the United States, specifically in the Civil War and Reconstruction eras. He's written a number of books, wrote a number of books during his lifetime on this era. And this Andrew Johnson biography, one of a couple of different presidential books that he wrote. He also did one for Rutherford B. Hayes, which is not the one that I have on the docket for this project. I have a different one upcoming. But this Andrew Johnson biography is one of not very many about the 17th president of the United States. And of course, I mean, you know, we talk about presidents who have poor legacies, and we've talked about quite a few of them already in this channel, many of the pre-Lincoln presidents. And Andrew Johnson, of course, the president immediately after Lincoln, has one of the worst of all, very possibly the worst president in the United States history. There's many candidates for that title, but Johnson certainly is one of the primo ones. Of course, grew up in Tennessee, that sort of made his political name there, as a senator, as a governor for a while. And he sort of grew in renown, I suppose, for being one of the very few Democratic politicians in these kind of slaveholding states who was very firmly in the Union camp during the Civil War, very staunchly opposed secession. And that caused him to gain some political capital in the Union. And of course, that eventually resulted in him becoming Lincoln's vice presidential nominee in 1864 and becomes the president after Lincoln is assassinated. And Johnson's, of course, the complete dismantling of Johnson's legacy comes in his handling of Reconstruction and that sort of thing, and how ultimately he sort of ruled with a very sort of unique iron fist, I suppose, in the sense that he had a very individualized view of how he wanted it done, that he was not willing to promote the freedom of African Americans in any way. He was a very staunch racist himself, and even though during this era in the late 1860s, you have things like the 14th Amendment that get passed that ultimately do provide the foundation for, the civil rights of African Americans and people of color, that it wasn't done without quite a bit of hand-wringing by Johnson himself. He pissed off at just about everybody in government, certainly in the Republican Party. And his presidency ultimately, which of course, at one point led to him being the first president to be impeached. His presidency ultimately has been seen as a complete failure, and his lack of willingness, his being unwilling to solidify civil rights as a fundamental right, his complete disinterest in wading into that question in any way, and his opposition to that issue, in fact, is exactly the reason why, Jim Crow laws passed. It's the reason why, the Ku Klux Klan and white supremacist groups like that ended up having sort of free reign in the South for a very long time. Just a horrible legacy, terrible legacy as a president. And, in a way, it makes you think that he would be a great candidate for a biography, but there's not too many out there. So this Trefousse biography is it is very solid. I think ultimately, if you have a takeaway, it's that it's a very solid overview of the life. And I think it's a biography that also is very, very willing to take its subject to task. it is not a devil's advocate biography. Like I think we've seen maybe with a couple of the biographies of controversial or disliked presidents that we've seen. The book that this kind of reminded me of was the book President Without a Party, the John Tyler biography that I reviewed very early on in this channel's history. That biography, I thought, did a really excellent job of just painting Tyler as a reprehensible person, as a horrible leader, and just someone who managed to piss everybody off. I mean, genuinely a stellar biography. Genuinely, I think one of the better presidential bios that I've read. And I don't think this Trefousse book is quite, from a literary standpoint, at that level, but it's that same type of thing. You walk away from this biography, when you learn more about who Johnson was and, understanding some of the impressive bits, like he overcame quite a bit of, lack of formal education and things like that. He overcame a lot to get to where he was, and that's impressive in its own right. But you ultimately, once you see just how virulently racist this guy was, and how much he had complete contempt for African Americans, and how much of a jarring transition that was from Abraham Lincoln, who had his faults, of course, but was ultimately very sympathetic to that cause and sympathetic to that plight. And Johnson comes in and clearly just despises them and does not give a fuck. And there's multiple quotes, multiple examples from throughout his entire life where this is evident. And so because of that, I mean, it's laid out to you very, very clearly just how much Johnson intentionally either tried to stop proper legislation from happening, how much he just didn't care, and again, just how many major figures he, picked political battles with. His whole thing with like Edwin Stanton and stuff is a major part of the story. He just comes across as just purely vile. And as someone on my end who, like, in thinking about the worst presidents in American history, has always put Johnson kind of in that like James Buchanan, Franklin Pierce, Donald Trump tier, I suppose, just kind of generically without necessarily having one who is like massively above the others. This book was enough to make me think, man, Johnson might be it. Johnson might be it. It's, he comes across incredibly poorly. And again, I think the author does a fair job at not coming across like he has entirely 100% contempt for his subject. Again, he gives Johnson credit for his abilities as a politician. He was certainly a skilled politician in his way, and that's especially evident in the earlier years, in like the 1840s and 1850s and stuff like that. It's his ability is evident. But it really does seem like it kind of goes off the rails once he becomes vice president. There's a little bit of like that. There's a little bit of almost Nixon-like paranoia to Johnson as well, which I thought was very interesting. And Trefousse does a good job of kind of talking about. I don't think this is a brilliantly written book. Again, I think this is what prevents me from saying this is an outstanding, superb biography. I think the big problem I have with Trefousse's writing here is that he consistently, all the time, will make claims about how Johnson felt or thought about something or what his thought process was, and makes no attempt at all to back up that claim with like a quote or anything like that. He just kind of makes an assertion and just moves on to the next point. And that's, I mean, I'm not going to accuse this book of being poorly researched, but like, that's not good historiography. That's not good historical writing. You need to back up what you're saying. It's not identical, but it's the same type of thing that I was getting on Shelby Foote about, right? It's just consistently like not attributing shit as much as you need to. And Trefousse does something similar, but in a slightly different way. Again, I think his perspective ultimately, I think, is fair. And again, I think he grapples with Johnson's legacy in a way that has actually held up pretty well overall. And he's very much, I think, trying to write this as a counter narrative to the sort of brief revival in public opinion of Johnson in like the 50s and 60s and whatnot. Like, this is very much a counterbalance to that. And in that sense, it's come across as actually aging pretty well. I just think the actual meat here, as far as like the writing and stuff like that, leaves a little bit to be desired. And so that's what we ultimately are left with here. This is a book that, in theory, I think could have been like a fairly, not paradigm shifting biography, but a pretty immense one and a really successful one. I go back to the John Tyler book. I thought that one was remarkably good, and remarkably underappreciated biography, one that I still think deserves more attention than it has. And I think this gets a lot of the way there, but I'm not entirely sold on the end product. I still think there is a Andrew Johnson biography out there that could be written that tackles the subject with a true, just sweeping scope and a truly like deft hand. Like, I think we still are waiting for a definitive biography on the man. But compared to some of the other books that I've talked about here, which are very dry, some of the other presidential biographies, which I think are very dry and ultimately have not aged very well. Like, if this is the best we can do for Andrew Johnson in the year 2025, then Johnson's got a better biography and a better biographer at his disposal than several of these other more obscure presidents. So there is that. I think ultimately it is a tentative recommendation. Again, a good biography that I would hesitate to say is anything more than that. But certainly I think Johnson as a figure is an important one to read about because, again, knowing his story, knowing his actions and lack thereof will help you understand how we got from the Civil War era and the seeming optimism of the end of it to, you know, ultimately the next 100 years worth of race relations in the United States. So much of that falls on his head and falls on his actions. And it's worth reading about them, and it's worth reading about how reprehensible they all are. So, not a classic biography, but I think one that is worth reading and a story that is worth exploring more in depth as well. So, check it out if you're interested. With that, I want to say thank you all so much for watching. Please make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. As always, more reviews are to come. Make sure to hit that bell for notifications and tell a friend as well. Thanks a lot, and I will see you next time right here at your home of the Music Deep Dive.